Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 17th paragraph of the first chapter of the first book of von Clausewitz's Vom Krige, the title being "The effect of polarity is often destroyed by the superiority of the defense over the attack, and thus the suspension of action in war is explained." Here the text. If the form of defense is stronger than that of offense, as we shall hereafter show, the question arises, is the advantage of a deferred decision as great on the one side as the advantage of the defensive form on the other? If it is not, then it cannot by its counterweight overbalance the latter, and thus influence the progress of the action of the war. We see, therefore, that the impulsive force existing in the polarity of interests may be lost in the difference between the strength of the offensive and the defensive, and thereby become ineffectual. If, therefore, that side for which the present is favorable is too weak to be able to dispense with the advantage of the defensive, he must put up with the unfavorable prospects which the future holds out. For it may still be better to fight a defensive battle in the unpromising future than to assume the offensive or make peace at present. Now, being convinced that the superiority of the defensive, rightly understood, is very great, and much greater than may appear at first sight, we conceive that a greater number of those periods of inaction which occur in war are thus explained without involving any contradiction. The weaker the motives to action are, the more will those motives be absorbed and neutralized by this difference between attack and defense. The more frequently, therefore, will action in warfare be stopped, as indeed experience teaches. So this is another very important paragraph that naturally goes along with especially the first two that we have read, and is introducing the difference existing between attack and defense as forms of war. Remembering that attack is the weakest form of war, but with the positive purpose, and defense the strongest form of war, but with the negative purpose or motive, as you want to call it. So here, naturally, these paragraphs have to be read in sequence, but here the concept is fundamentally observing how the suspension of the action in war is fundamentally explained by the difference existing between the difference existing between defense and attack over an attack, and most especially the superiority of the defense over the attack. So here, von Clausewitz says, if the form of defense is stronger than that of offense, as we shall see, shall hereafter show, the question arises: is the advantage of a deferred decision as great on the one side as the advantage of the defensive form on the other? So, in other words, is justifiable fundamentally to defer or to suspend the action of war if you can expect to derive from the advantage of defense a greater, a better result? So if it is not, then it cannot be its counterweight overbalance the latter, and thus influence the progress of the action of war. So if it is not, of course, this shouldn't happen. So there wouldn't be an essential difference between attack and defense as forms of war, and the action would fundamentally go back to what von Clausewitz says had exemplified in this sense ex absurdo in the paragraph before, into which fundamentally there is only one form of war. That is the attack of the enemy at that point. That at that point it's just a motive leading the aggression, and therefore not minding about playing fundamentally on the options that attack and defense time after time can present combined. So then he goes on and says, we see therefore that the impulsive force existing in the polarity of interests may be lost in the difference between the strength of the offensive and the defensive, and thereby become ineffectual. So here von Clausewitz is making a very poignant point by observing that the impulsive force that would be entailed by this abstract polarized fight between the two wrestlers, absorbed, as he says, by or to be lost, excuse me, in the difference. So he uses, it's actually the same, he also uses absorb, but here it's even more incisive. It says to be lost, to get lost, so to be fundamentally, virtually ininfluent, or at least not even strictly identifiable to determine what is actually going on into this action, between the strength of the offensive and the defensive. So between this gap, fundamentally, this difference that exists, this difference in potential, fundamentally, that can heavily, at this point, influence your decision whether to attack or not, and thereby becoming effectual. So fundamentally, even leading the action in war. So here he goes with an example. We've seen how he proceeds. Usually he gives this initial thought, then presenting kind of a more concrete example. He says, if, therefore, that side for which the present is favorable is too weak to be able to dispense with the advantage of the defensive, he must put up with the unfavorable prospects which the future holds out. For it may still be better to fight a defensive battle in the unpromising future than to assume the offensive or make peace at present. So this is particularly important because of the premise. So you have this fighter, which is faced with a favorable situation for him, right? But yet he is too weak at this moment to be able to dispense with the advantage of the defensive. So at this point, what this means is that if he attacks, he has no apparent benefit, even if there is a kind of a favorable action where his force could be partly spent to effectively, let's say, damage the enemy consistently, but still not being able to come back on it, fundamentally. So he is still in this moment that every commander can assess, in which, okay, what do I do? Do I attack or do I defend? And the answer being, well, okay, it's kind of more, at least I expect to be more advantageous for now to rely on the advantage that defensive gives to me. Now, von Clausewitz has still hasn't still explained fundamentally how the thing works. In fact, these paragraphs that introduce already the relation between attack and defense are still relatively vague in the measure in which, but there is a very strong physical evidence for this. That is, you spend much more energy, physically speaking, to attack than defending. So this defense has an intrinsic advantage, which doesn't mean that every defense is better than any attack, because this varies in every kind of situation, but tendentially, this is for the individual fighter that at that point has to decide whether to attack or to defend, what to do. And this is already in Nutra, if you want, the way in which the suspension of the action of war is explained. Because for the only fact, first of all, of wondering whether this is the right thing to do or not, you realistically understand that there is a time of inaction. You have to spend planning, you have to spend organizing and assessing your forces, etc. But also, there is the potential advantage of saying, okay, I may delay the action now, because what I believe in that, in spite the situation is kind of favorable now, I expect that in the future I might gain even a greater result by defending myself than launching an attack now. So what the point that von Clausewitz here makes is that for this fighter, yeah, let's call him this way, it may still be better to fight a defensive battle in the unpromising future than to assume the offensive or make peace at present. In other words, you realize that this also partly explains the kind of the negative motive of war. Why is that von Clausewitz had these things of, not just that defense is the stronger form of war and an attack is the weaker, but respectively defense in fact is also the form with the negative motive and attack with the positive, because defense is effectively delaying the action. So this is bringing into the fight, into war, fundamentally a how do you say this in excuse me, an extension, a lengthening, let's say, of the fight, into which forces are still consumed. I mean, effectively you're making the fight lasting longer. Von Clausewitz, preferably to make you understand also what war should be in theory, says that this is he doesn't that the fact that war in this sense is a negative, that the defense has a negative motive and purpose, and attack a positive purpose, doesn't have any moral quality, intrinsically speaking. But von Clausewitz says in theory, for him, how war should really be done, if you really want to avoid the majority of bloodshed, paradoxically, is to get it done with it as soon as you can. I mean, in terms of just attacking, so go for it, attack and go for the fight, and don't delay, because in the moment in which you delay, it is true, you may be waiting effectively from your side for this more favorable circumstance that may occur in which you will be attacked and you will have this advantage deriving from the defense. But at the same time, and here he doesn't address it, but it's also very important, you're still kind of wearing yourself down, just like the enemy is. Now, what is interesting about this phrase is that he says not just that sometimes it would be better to fight a defensive battle in the future rather than assume the offensive at the moment, but also to make peace. So this is not something that applies just to war in itself, but it kind of presents the general relation that exists, the general options that exist in the relation between two conflicting entities, two conflicting actors, let's say. And therefore, these many, let's say, peace in general can, or even alliances, are kind of think about, I don't know, the alliance between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union for invading Poland jointly. It was obvious that they both Germany and Soviet Russia perfectly knew that they would have arrived to war sooner or later. But at that point, it was better for them to still delay. Obviously, everybody had kind of different problems in that sense. This is kind of a complex example, but it's still very meaningful because it makes you realize that there was an inherent conflict between those two powers, and yet they weren't fighting yet. Why? Because they were expecting that fundamentally there would have been a greater benefit. In that case, it was a bit both-sided in the sense that the evolution back from the beginning could contemplate either it depended who could attack or defend. It was at one point it was more important for Germany to attack because they knew that Soviet Russia in a couple of years would have gotten effectively too strong to defeat, even in defense, and therefore they wanted to attack it before it became too strong. And that was the problems of Soviets. So that's how it also explained this timing, and also the fact that Germany had a necessity of a let's say of a economical situation in terms of production and Belgic capacities, that military capacities that were able to carry out that attack Operation Barbarossa. So it's one of those examples that give you why there is a suspension of the action of war, given still in this in this introductory and theoretical, but nevertheless very at the same time very concrete in terms of reasoning, a polar idea of the fight that effectively doesn't exist in reality. So and that von Clausewitz used in fact to demonstrate the absurdity of such polar conception, so where there is a perfect reciprocity between the two attacks, because he says there is this difference in potential between attack and defense that makes attacking and defending the same fighting against the same enemy two very different things, two totally different things. So just digress with historical examples, but addressing that topic requires much greater space of time. And just to make you understand that here there is a motive that justifies, in fact, inaction without contradicting the nature of war. And this is essentially what the relations between every human being and every state in proportion, on broader scale, fundamentally work like. War is just a tool of politics. This is the point. War in itself doesn't cause the conflict. It's the conflict that brings politics to use violence. And therefore this decision lays also in the expectation of what you can gain. That also kind of messes up the situation, because it's not based on war. It's based on interests. It's based also on the reaction of the people. It's based on a series of elements that come to modify and control war in a way that makes it basically detached from this ideal abstraction of a polar conflict that fundamentally in reality doesn't exist. This is very, very important to understand, in my opinion, because, and not just my opinion, because this is really the core of Clausewitzian thought, and it is how Saint von Clausewitz teaches us, also backed by heavily in evidence by military history, by the experience of the world we live in, and it's not really a matter of opinion at all. So here, where were we? Here it says, okay, yeah, and then he goes and says, now, being convinced that the superiority of the defensive, rightly understood, is very great, and much greater than may appear at first sight, we conceive that the great number of those periods of inaction which occur in war are thus explained without involving any contradiction. So this is a bit what we just said right now. Then here he introduces also another element, that is that at least in part, here he says, we consider a greater number of those periods of inaction which occur in war does explain without any. Okay, yes, meaning that there is still some room for mistake, right? But it's nevertheless very important that still they this time of inaction is mostly conceived as a sorry, there is an annoying fly in here that I would like to kill. Here we go. I got it. Sorry. And you see in here I was about to get the fly, and I had to wait, because I didn't know what was the most favorable moment to grab it, to strangle it, fundamentally. But I had to wait. So this doesn't involve in itself any contradiction, if not in part my mistakes in assessment. Meaning what? Meaning that in fact, of course, and I may make a wrong decision, but also in here the thing gets extremely complicated, because what is a wrong decision? I mean, in the realm of reality, of course, there is a wrong decision in the sense that you could do something better, maybe you go into another direction, but not necessarily you may know at the moment that there is a contradiction into this. And this is so a mistake or a miscalculation. So this is now not really von Clausewitz introduces this in the fog of, when he speaks about the fog of war and all this stuff, but so we will leave it for later times. But here it's still very important, because he this indecision, this moment of assessment, contains in itself, as we see by definition, the fact that we don't know at all times what the exact situation really is. Our cognitive means do not allow to do it. We don't know what reality 100% is. We will never do, probably better for us, also because we got shaped biologically with the same cognitive means, so we're made essentially for it, and this is why also war works like this by definition. But there is a kind of an extra time that is added now to the suspension of the action of war, that is fed fundamentally by this ignorance and this need for assessing better what the situation is. So this is particularly important because you realize that it's effectively a great part of this inaction that is occupied by all these problems of actually finding out what the hell we're gonna do now, what is more convenient, because it may be, and it's often actually not is so evident as it may seem at all, because in fact we also have to deal with predictability. So here it's not just a simple calculation. What do I do? Do I attack or the defense based on what this is? Because things change, and things change, motives change constantly. Both our own and one of the enemies, So we have to come to assess this in a very approximate way, and therefore there is always a component of indecision that is kind of always is rooted into the decisional process in any way. So however, at the end of the thing, what is important is that there is no contradiction by the suspension of the action of war in itself. There is never something like an absolute use of violence. We've already seen it. The outcome of war is never absolute. Why? Because it's always regulated by these factors. So you can even wipe out physically the enemy, but still you have never used as much force as you could in order to achieve it, and also most of the times it's not actually how it what the outcome turns out is at the end, let's say. And there is nothing like a very end, because conflictuality in this sense is inherent to human nature. So you may never know what is going to trigger you next. This is also particularly important, and this becomes very complicated, especially when we're talking about not individuals, but masses, as a matter of fact, because already individuals are kind of a mystery on their own, but masses are even more. And as a matter of fact, none of us actually knows what the world is about. I mean, we all have our own field of, in which, let's say, not necessarily of expertise. I don't know what you're up to, but in general, we all know something better, something worse. But nobody knows about nobody knows the everything. And in war, this is particularly evident when it comes, in fact, to the decisional process. How do we exploit this gap existing between attack and defense? How can we measure that? I mean, we know it's there, but we have to calibrate our decisions on how this gap swings, because sometimes it can even change in sense, because sometimes effectively attack can be more profitable than defense. Sometimes do not follow those memes who attribute to von Clausewitz wrongly the fact that the best form of attack is defense, because according to von Clausewitz the best form of defense is attack, because according to von Clausewitz the best form of defense is defense, point. So let's not flip it, but tendentially defense is kind of better in fact than attack. It can occasionally happen also the other way around, but this also makes me think about that other consideration that von Clausewitz made on the attitude of human nature to kind of delay, to postpone, not ever to kind of attack directly something immediately, because the human mind is and body is tendentially saying, okay, let's do it later. We are great delayers by nature. We prefer not to stress ourselves too much. If we were without stimulations, if we were not in fact troubled by problems, we would be idling. We would probably extinguish ourselves. But in that observation is useful in here, in my opinion, to remind, because it also explains you how easier it is tendentially to side from towards the fence, to remain into the fence, like let's delay. That's tendentially what humans do. So this also adds to the idleness sometimes that can occur into war. Independently from what war it is and how it is really fought tactically or strategically, this is a general tendency, an absolute tendency, if you want. And this is very important to remember when approaching the Clausewitzian thought, because von Clausewitz is interested only in real war, actually, but in order to explain it to you, he has always to distinguish what happens tendentially as an absolute tendency. Even if you have this system, well, that's the value towards which it tends, the whole equation. But according to the other variables, this can also take another side. So it's in those variables that you have to be able to assess. So in other words, in real war, what's the case, time by time after time. Also because it's a physical principle. As we were saying before, attack means to consume more energies than in defense. Also defense consume energies, because you don't literally idle. You're still out there. You're still in the war. So there is a cost to that. Just think the logistical costs. It's not that always remaining idling actually has all these great advantages. It doesn't necessarily make you grow lazier and less reactive, but because in theory you have to contrast that with keeping yourself and strengthening yourself. But as a matter of fact, even this strengthening can bring to certain problems. Just think logistically speaking, staying. No, this is a kind of a trivial but not so trivial example, but think about the hygienic problems of a camp, of an encampment. This is historically one of the most pressing problems for anyone, especially during sieges, where there is a stationary war, where there is this attrition. Idling also sensibly weakens you if you don't react to it. So it makes you consume energies, and an army is not going to stand forever. it wears out in terms of energies of force. I mean, this is self-evident. You need your troops to be constantly fed and equipped, etc. So that consumes energies that you have to make come from somewhere. But the attack, in this sense, is way more absorbing in terms of resources. It also has a more let's say it's also more difficult to coordinate. In this sense, defense is more predictable than attack in terms of outcome. And that's also why when you have someone in defense and someone in attack, von Clausewitz says, well, usually that's where the bloodiest battles are ever fought, usually, when more people die in a short amount of time. Because paradoxically, if you have to attack, let's say two fighters attacking at the same time, actually the impact, you might think it's kind of more punching, right? It is not. It is not. And this is where the battles in which both the contents and attack usually are not very bloody, because they always kind of because they are attacking, they're always kind of about to call off the offensive if something goes wrong, because during the attack energies get dissolved much more quickly, so you're in a kind of a higher state of alert to call that offensive off, because it can realistically go seriously wrong more quickly than you can normally react, whereas in defense you have kind of more time, you have other problems. One of the greatest ones is to leave the initiative to the enemy, which is not a few, but it's still kind of generally more, you know more what to do. So that's where the main bloodshed happens. Whereas when two are attacking, there is always this situation for which one is to retreat more, and the whole thing also is more difficult to counterbalance. There are many. These are all things that we will see going on with the Vom Krige. But von Clausewitz had already had already explained it quite clearly, since the first assumptions that were the first principles that states, like that an attack grows weaker the more it progresses. This is a general evidence, and there is a lot of the world of physics in here involved at the same time. I wanted to say something else, but I don't remember now, so let's go on. It says, the weaker the motives to action are, the more will those motives be absorbed and neutralized by this difference between attack and defense. The more frequently, therefore, will action in warfare be stopped, as indeed experience teaches. So this is a very beautiful conclusion, because here it brings back the concept of the motive, of what is pushing you actively to fight. Let's always remember, you're not fighting for nothing or for the sake of it, or in an abstract reality where you just have to knock out what you have in front of you. There's always politics, controlling the military instrument at all times, and limiting at all times in a kind of a dominating fashion. So you can, the military instrument can be revoked from a moment to another. So you have, everything is directly linked to the motives that brought the military instrument to be used at that point, that are political. So the weaker these motives are, as you understand, and the more will these motives be absorbed and neutralized by the difference existing between attack and defense. This is very important, because the motive at one point of going to action can be weaker than the advantage that the defense has over attack, and there is therefore this preserving attitude that may make you in a conflictual situation even sign a peace, but not making the war stop. In fact, as we often say, when you have to explain a war and its causes, especially, well, explaining the causes of a war, or even the beginning of a war, is extremely complicated, because you have to explain the origins of the conflict. and explaining the origins of the conflict is very, very difficult, because it's not something you can track like a battle that is already very difficult to, I don't know, to identify in itself, but at least you know, hopefully, when it's being fought, in which campaign and all this stuff. But the question is, you know, since when this enmity between these two sides actually started? Because what you see in war is just an epiphenomenon. Let's say the higher escalation between these two, in this conflict with violence and all. So it's kind of also more emotionally absorbing. We also discussed extensively about this and why we do give all this emotional importance to war. Why we don't care if, I don't know, millions of people die of cancer because there is a product that is toxic, but we care if, you know, thousands of people get killed by bombs. And the two things have a disproportionate equal ratio. Because war, in this sense, is misunderstood. War is taken just as an extrapolated phenomenon out of context and saying, okay, well, that's just about those fight that is going on. It is like two idiots that wanted to smash each other's head with a club because they're a bunch of primitives. Well, this is nothing at all. That's just an instrument that is going to be used by people who already have a conflictuality that is way more widespread, way more branched and deeply rooted than you can imagine. And that is a conflictuality that at this point is on the head of all of us in some measure, because we are all conflictual. It's written in our genes that we are conflictual. We function like that. I mean, in the way even we approach reality, we use, in fact, force in many ways. Adrenaline serves that purpose. We do have a if you want, even a dichotomic approach to reality. I mean, reason obviously makes us kind of more thoughtful and abstracted, detached, let's say, but we're still very heavily moved by these impulses of a primordial violence. In fact, as Vom Krige calls it, that is effectively what drives us, even in everyday life, and even for good, because any psychiatrist and any psychologist teaches you that a certain amount of violence is necessary for an healthy life, because otherwise we would just be I don't know what, some mollusks that just stay there and do nothing. That's why there is no golden age, because that's how we explain civilization in part. If you look at the Bible, we effectively explain civilization not just with the original sin that kind of brought mankind away from, you know, the earthly paradise where we didn't have to do anything essentially to earn things, but it also makes us pass through Cain killing Abel. It is effectively, you know, you killing your own brother and going out there in the world and starting to build cities and tools and stuff like that. So that, in other words, civilization. So as you understand, even this monotheisms and many other religions and philosophies have deeply interiorized this fall of man in order to explain what all our society is about. If you don't understand the nature of conflict, you can't understand fundamentally why politics and war happen, because it's like detaching them from reality and just thinking that there is some evil guy that wants things to happen. Well, sometimes it does happen that there is an evil guy, but it's never so simple. It's never just one person. It's the masses that put up this broad dimensions. And von Clausewitz is one the greatest thinker to bring out this. I mean, the fact that masses, that the peoples have definitely an impact into this, that have an importance, that war cannot be reduced to just a head of state that decides to invade this other. There is all a very delicate and complicated relation between the people, politics, violence and war. So that needs to be deciphered, needs to be understood. So that effectively you can't study military history if you think to extrapolate it, to extrapolate war and violence from this political and social basis, because that's, by the way, how war gets also kind of I wouldn't say exorcised, but in a way also depleted of its own true face. Because if you think just at war like as a gallant engagement in a chivalric fashion, where you know there are just two guys, I don't know, respecting each other and just fighting for some reason imposed, but you don't understand the real violence that exists behind it, the hate, the despair. How can you understand war if you don't look at the effect of deaths, of people dying, and people dying being killed? I mean, this is essentially what violence brings to. So you need a motive to kill someone. And it's not something that happens quickly. It's even anti-natural in many ways. Many people, this is also what we have dealt with many times, many people assume that war exemplifies the primordial nature of humanity. This is not really the case. War is something different. War passes through way more than primordial violence. Primordial violence is just this inherent sense of hostility and conflictuality that is inherent to human nature, but that doesn't automatically translate into, go to kill your next. This is particularly important because, in fact, war is not instinctual. Violence and rage and hostility, let's say, is instinctual, but it never quite gets to kill people. I mean, humans are biologically programmed to shout at each other, at a distance, to throw rocks at each other. That's fundamentally what we're designed to. We're not designed to have a person in front of us and shooting and blowing his brains out. That's not how it works. So even war is something artificial that is effectively built through our society, also through reason, through politics. So something that is that goes beyond mere instincts. Animals do not make war. At least they don't fight in the way humans fight, with the dynamics, with the planning, with the, if you want, even the abstraction from instinct. War is waged, and so war passes through reason, and more importantly, those who win generally are those who make use of reason, not of instinct. In war, by general rule, not by law, but by general rule, it's more intelligent that wins, not the strongest. There is a planning, there is a ability to, in fact, to calculate what risk is, and why to go out there and risking your life. That is something that goes consistently against your instinct of survival. That is effectively the together with the reproductive needs, what drives humanity in itself. So it's something that goes completely the other way in instinct. It's something that makes you get killed, that gets you killed. So it can't be instinctual. As a matter of fact, it's not instinctual. Humans started to make war only from a certain period onwards, which doesn't mean that before that, that there wasn't a guy who, got angry and smashed his neighbor's head with a rock. But that is not war. War is an organized employment of violence that passes through politics. So through a social organization. It's something very, very different than mere violence. So, what I was saying is that I started this by observing that the difference between attack and defense can, as von Clausewitz puts it, absorb or neutralize the motives that bring you to use violence. And that's why you can get to a peace that, however, doesn't settle the matter once and for all. But at that point, it's politics that, very far from having disappeared in the meanwhile, kind of gets violence out of the way and starts to act with other means that still entail violence, by the way, in potential, through deterrence, for instance. And war can break out once again, just as it was interrupted. So, what is saying here by concluding is that this is even a true experience. Because, as we will see in the Clausewitzian theory, the experience offered by military history, so the history of war, of mankind, is showing us, brings us to stop war, also due to this difference in potential existing between attack and defense. So, as you're understanding here, the concept of polarity is completely completely requisite. Completely requisite. There is no thing like polarity. There are not poles. We don't live in a polar world. The powers that rule over the world at this time do not at any time never had a polar relation. It never happened that, as one grew stronger, the other had necessarily to grow weaker, and vice versa. It doesn't work like that. In history, things can go back and forth for an endless series of motives. It's pretty obvious that there is this tendency of, if there is an inherent conflict, at a certain point to exploit the weaker, or the weakness of your enemy, but and expanding as it grows weaker or attacking. But that may be influenced by tons of other things that may not make you head in that direction, and there is not this principle of polarity, because at that point, politics, the feelings of the people, the internal cohesion of your state and whatever can change from a moment to another. So there is not just war. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that, especially if you go out there also on YouTube and you see all these videos that show you the evolution of empires and so on. Yeah, it's true. There is a tendency to feel as those areas that the another force is leaving fundamentally and is withdrawing from, but that's just because we organize themselves to achieve that, not because objectively there is a mathematical equation that brings that to happen magically by definition. So it takes a will, it takes a decision, it takes the reasoned will to carry out that effort. So it's not easy as that. And I think that studying military history for real is what really teaches you how in this sense the military instrument is aseptic in itself. It doesn't actually have an end to itself. We don't make war because we enjoy it. These are some of the greatest misconceptions that were brought, I don't know, that were born in during, from pacifism or to a general critique. I don't know what is about that, but stating such things is like going against everything that we have discovered now scientifically, from anthropology, from sociology, from biology, from psychiatry, you know, from and it's embarrassing sometimes to see how our own world still indulges itself into thinking that we are some pure beings that are just stained by the evil of a couple of evil people. Because here the problem is not, it's not, determining. I'm sorry I brought the discussion on this kind of moral basis, but I wanted to make the very exact point, the very reverse, the very opposite point, because it's sure that there are people who do bad, evil things, but this is a moral judgment. War pertains to and something that effectively dictates your choices. War in itself is devoid of this. War in itself has a specific weight that we have seen is strictly physical as well. It kills people, but it's still an instrument. It doesn't own in itself the good or the evil. It's who uses it that has determined for its own motives, whichever they are, whether that's good or evil, whether, in other words, that's acceptable or not, that is to be done or not. So, pretending to erase war from our political options is not just, it's not wrong in moral terms, it's wrong in physical terms. That is impossible. That is impossible. War is always an option of politics, and it can never cease to be as long as we are human beings. That cannot go in any other way. There is no option, there is no alternative. Which doesn't mean that you have to make war. It simply means that war is always an option, which is a wholly different thing, and which increases dramatically the need for an ethical, for an ethical education, because it's like when your parents teach you, not to, to push other kids and stuff like that. Well, that's done also for rather kind of anthropological reasons, etc. But that's why we have things like morality. That's why we have things like ethics. And reducing war to just a weird thing that happens, that is crazy, that has no sense, is the best way to teach other people to be responsible about it. Because you deal with it at, even if you attribute it to someone's fault, which is, it's always kind of someone's fault whether it happens or not, but then you have to determine whether it was a good or bad choice. But you kind of abstract it from its real roots that at the end of the day also have to do with you. Because a person who criticizes war just for the sake of it, or advocates for war just for the sake of it, consistently is like, like a child with a gun. Because if that person votes or has any influence whatsoever on the society lives in, is still pushing for doing something pretty serious, whether it's for better or for worse. So the best way is to abandon ideological stance and to measure case by case when it's the case to act. But this is, at the end of the day, what I always say after my von Clausewitz at the end of my von Clausewitz videos. Nevertheless, this paragraph I think was dramatically important because it kills the concept of polarity. There is no polarity. Go out there, cry it out loud. We do not live in a polar world. There's never been such a thing. Not even during the Cold War. Never, ever, by definition. And much of the absence of this polarity lays, in fact, also in this great difference in potential that exists between attack and defense. I say in potential, but it's translated into kind of kinetic energy on the field, on the battlefield, very, very evidently, and much more powerfully than any word can express. Because war is brutal. It's effectively an act of violence. That's von Clausewitz's definition. War is nothing but an act of violence. It's violence delivered in the way combat works. So it's there are not many other ways you can do it, that you wouldn't go to war otherwise. And so we will also definitely have time to get more thoroughly into this topics the more we progress with the Vom Krige. Another couple of things I could add. I don't remember. At least nothing that I probably already said. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.